Hi, everyone. Welcome to the September 15th, 2021 iteration of SIG Auth. Thank you all for joining us. First, for the polls of note, it looks like we have a new KEP for the secret store CSI driver. Okay, cool.
Yeah, this one, we had an issue in our backlog after we moved it as a SIG Auth subproject to add a retroactive KEP. So we just went through the process and added a KEP, and then also try to answer some of the questions in PRR as we are looking to go stable.
Awesome. Who would be the good reviewers for this KEP? I'm happy to review. Did you have anyone in mind?
Yeah, so I tagged you and Rita because I think you were the initial folks who helped move the project under SIG Auth. And I
Awesome.
also tagged Mo on this one. So
cool. Great. Well, let's review it offline. And yeah, thank you for making sure that these changes are documented.
Thank you.
Okay, so if, let's start off with designs of note. Rob, do you want to
yeah,
take it away?
Thanks. Yeah, so we've got a lot going on in Gateway API. I sent an email out to the mailing list as well and got a bit of feedback there. But the high level idea here is that we're trying to enable cross namespace references safely. The way, the most common use case here is that infrastructure admin, a cluster admin, is trying to provision load balancing infrastructure in a infra namespace and then route to applications in application namespaces throughout their cluster. So we need some way of making some kind of handshake there. This has also come up, this kind of need for or desire to enable cross namespace references came up with Bucket API. And so I just linked that KEP there. There's discussion somewhere down at the bottom where I think Tim references that, hey, this could be very relevant to what Gateway API is doing with reference policy. And Tim had suggested, hey, why don't we bring this to SIG Auth and see if, one, this proposal even makes sense, and two, if it makes sense for this to be more generic and not just a Gateway API concept, but a Kubernetes concept or some kind of place that it can be shared more broadly.
Yeah, what's the best way for us to get an understanding of how it works? Do you want to walk through it, or do you want to share your screen?
Yeah, no, this is fine. Fine. What you have is fine. So in this example, really a reference policy has a from and a to. That's all a reference policy is. The from includes a group, kind, and namespace, and the to includes a group and kind. So the reference policy exists in the target namespace, and it allows the target to say, I'm going to accept references from these kinds in these namespaces. And I recognize that for a more generic audience, resource may be a better fit than kind, but beyond that distinction, this is a fairly generic way of saying, I accept references from this namespace and this, resources of this kind in this namespace. That's the high level idea here. It's a fairly simple concept, I think, and it's very useful for Gateway API, but potentially useful elsewhere.
Yeah, I guess this reminds me of, this seems like similar, I guess a similar model that I can think of that I've seen used before is to use the same authorization language. I think in Kubernetes open source that would be RBAC, but have something like resource principles. So I think the thing that's missing from RBAC is the ability to specify a resource as the subject of a policy.
Yeah. Yeah, we did briefly discuss if this could be possible with RBAC in any way, and like you said, could not find a way to make that work.
As far as the general purpose nature of it, is there a concern that if you do this, that you'll get bogged down later if something does generically come up? There's certainly I've seen a couple of proposals like this over the years in various ecosystems around Cube. So it's not as if it's kind of been it's been punted. No one's actually gone through with it or extensively used it. So are you concerned that if you were to do the type specific to Gateway API that you'd regret it later on? Or is it a fear of missing out or a fear of having to change it later?
So I think this is really just, we've gotten feedback from API reviewers that this feels like it is not a unique problem to Gateway API. And specific to this specific bucket API example here, this is one where they're trying to find another way to do cross namespace references. And I think Tim is saying basically, do we have to, create this whole process all over again, or can we share concept? Can we share a resource? Can we, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I only bring that up in the context of if you had to introduce a new, more general purpose reference policy, there's nothing that prevents your controllers from also honoring that. So yeah. It's not as if it's a less painful. It is less painful than other types of, if we put an object, maybe something will come along later to replace it. Since there hasn't been a huge amount of people who hit this problem, maybe the pattern right now is more interesting than the generic capability. That would probably be my gut. I know people who want things like this in different contexts, but I'm not sure they want exactly what's there. So I couldn't even support a generic one with more than maybe a couple of examples versus like 10 or 20 people who would all be banging on the door trying to get that.
I had a question about so there was a discussion of encoding in RBAC. What is the barrier to encoding it? I'm not saying necessarily that's a great idea, but it seems like you could just have, just like today users are referenced with system : service account, you could have system : resource : namespace : type, and just encode it directly in RBAC. Those
should be validated and rejected. You wouldn't be able to submit that. Unless that validation didn't make it in, but that's my memory.
Yeah, I think there's support for groups, users, service accounts. The kinds of those subjects are limited.
I don't know. So at least on that angle, allowing other types of kinds on the subject of RBAC doesn't seem, I'm sure there's subtle things, but it's not, if you don't understand something, you can't grant access to it, is a little bit different from if I don't know how to use this. So, but that's also a bigger change in a V1 API. So that would probably have a little bit higher of a bar. Is there a way for us to experiment? Is anyone else, Mike, has anybody else actually wanted that recently? I've certainly done terrible things with RBAC in the past, but I haven't seen anybody using that pattern or heard someone ask for it.
I think the problem is being able to issue a subject access review to match that. So I think I think resource principles are generally useful and to be able to check authorization on, which I think this is what the problem is. I don't know, for the things that I think about for that is like a GCS bucket being able to read a key, or a storage bucket being able to read a key in KMS or something like that. I think that is a useful thing to be able to declare in an authorization policy. As far as experimenting with that in Kubernetes, I don't know if there's a good way, because you need to be able to issue a subject access review. I guess in this case, it would probably be in some sort of admission controller for.
Doesn't the gateway controller run as a user?
Yes.
Would we allow you to attempt to impersonate a resource when we do a check?
What? Why not?
Yeah,
Or I guess
I don't know of any reason it's interesting,
right?
Because the moment you're saying this, I'm like, I don't see anything at the fundamental principle. It's more could we coherently come up with like a small experiment that would allow people to test this? Like, certainly,
Right.
like, I'm not opposed to the resource principle either. It's a little further afield than the reference policy. It might take longer. So that's one knock in it.
Sure.
So why could you not just encode this in a username? If that's what you want to experiment with, right? The way you would get your subject access reviews by saying
Mo, put a penny in the jar. That was a terrible idea.
So, but I mean that is what Mike was saying, right? We can't do a.
I think you're technically correct.
Yes, we could do that within a username, and you would be a bad person for suggesting it. But no, I mean that is actually the most concrete way that you could test it right now, and then you would have to be able to impersonate that username to do the check through subject access review.
You don't have to impersonate them to do a subject access review. If you want to do a self-subject access review, you need to impersonate them.
Yeah, fair point. Okay.
But stepping back for a second, is the ignoring RBAC or the actual implementation, is doing cross namespace stuff in general a good idea? Like, I like that my namespaces can't talk to other namespaces. That's the point.
I mean, everybody likes that until they give root access to all secrets, and then the whole cluster explodes in a giant mess of unsustainable security.
Well, hey. So I'm from the SIG storage group, working on object storage access, and object storage is one kind of storage which is always over the network, and in our work we need the ability to share object storage buckets across namespaces. So we've been asked to look into the reference policy design that you're working on. That's why I'm here today. So that's one use case where we need cross namespace access or referencing.
Yeah, and I'd say it's also a very common request for load balancing infrastructure, whatever you would classify that as, to really define your load balancers, configure them in one, sealed off space, a separate namespace, but then still be able to reference your applications running in their regular application namespaces, especially if that can be done safely, especially if there's some kind of handshake mechanism involved.
So Clayton, on the KCP stuff that you guys have been working on with like that workspace concept, doesn't some of that stuff like help with this, right? Like if you can group namespaces together and then the grouping is what contains the the gateway thing or whatever you want to share your storage thing. Like it feels like you wouldn't necessarily need a handshake or something so fancy if you could have a different grouping concept outside of namespace.
Well, ironically, Mo, I was just about to say this is that even needs handshaking even more, because in most like tenant systems, there's the angle of you accidentally give more permissions than you intend to a trusted party, like confused deputy sorts of scenarios. And the flip side is that someone else confuses you by giving you access to a whole bunch of stuff you didn't want. And so the kind of handshake is a pretty fundamental thing. Actually, I was gonna continue that thought that you had, Mo, as well as the previous one, which is, what's the better model of a handshake? Is it domain specific or generic? If it's an RBAC, you get a certain set of things you can represent as policy, but you lose the ability to do anything domain specific over time. And I think this was the spec status question, which is, reference policy that is specific to gateway can carry additional useful policy information over time. Reference policy that is generic or resource principles cannot and would never be able to. So you might end up needing a new resource if you wanted to extend it with additional, constructs.
Yeah, that's kind of how we're thinking about it too. We're thinking of building an, assuming reference policy is in place, we're thinking of building a new resource on top of reference policy to do what you just mentioned. So yeah, if there's a better way, if reference policy can be extended to do that for us, that's even better.
There's a like, this goes all the way back to like data modeling, but like been thinking about this a lot recently. Like a generic object is great when almost everybody's problem is generic. So ingress, and it's terrible when they only look similar and you want to add a bunch of stuff. So maybe that's like the specifically for object storage and for gateway. Is this truly generic? If it truly is generic and there's enough people, over time, we might get more examples of it, such that we would be like, oh, the generic object is obvious. But the generic object will come with a lot of constraints. So yeah, that's really y'all's domain, but it is something that comes up a lot when we talk about how would someone else understand what the relationships are.
We also need to decide whether it's an authorization problem or something domain specific.
Yeah. Trying to think if there's any other examples in Cube that have come up recently, like a lot of like creating namespaces and giving people access to them. If you have a system that allows people to create namespaces on a cluster, and Mo knows, like this kind of Mo, I think this is some of what we were both thinking there is, if you allow people to go and create namespaces, and then you can, by virtue of automatically getting access in a namespace, you can also add people to that namespace. And then somebody goes and tries to do hey, we want to list all of the things you can do. That opens up like, name squatting and typo squatting type of challenges. I don't think it's a fundamental problem for Gateway in this context, but the more general problem, it might be the more you have more untrusted entities working together, the less well a lot of these APIs work, because then you need additional APIs that let you understand the list of things that you can use. So because Cube is kind of one trust domain and namespaces are only a weak separator, maybe a similarly lightweight separator like reference policy might actually be the best approach versus RBAC, which is, I don't know if RBAC can provide all those guarantees, but RBAC is close to a very simple generic object.
When are these reference policies checked in, I guess, the current implementation of Gateway?
So this is still in a proposed unimplemented, well, V1 Alpha 1 is implemented, but this version of the API is unreleased as of today. So the proposal is that implementations controllers will check this as they are basically building out their proxy rules, building out Envoy, Nginx, whatever configuration that they need to. But this is very much a requirement on implementations of this API.
What happens if the reference policy is changed?
Yeah, it's going to be like everything else, where just one more resource that you need to watch, and so you watch routes in this case, and you'd watch reference policy, and if any part of that changes, you need to rewrite your rules, basically.
So like all other exclusion policies we've ever done in Cube, we always need to go through what's the default, and does the default make sense, and can someone specify the default globally, like we've done for network policy and egress policy and 7 other billion policies. Do y'all have a decision on that today? Is there another object that someone has to read to understand the default policy, or is reject always the right default policy?
Reject is what we've determined is always the right default policy. Same namespace references are always accepted. And anytime you try and do a cross namespace reference, it needs to be accompanied by a reference policy, otherwise it's rejected.
Okay. And there are some, this came up in a completely separate discussion recently, but there were some arguments that if we had in Cube, and if this had made sense at the time when Cuba, would we have made cross namespace network policy deny by default? There were some arguments that maybe that would have been a more normal default, and then you would define your policy up front. There's some similar arguments there, even though network's a much broader problem, and there's lots of different ways people could slice it. So that at least makes sense to me. I don't think that's an incorrect default policy from a security perspective for what you've described. And it is a one-to-one relationship which works in your advantage because you don't have bulk references. Are there any scenarios that you've discussed bulk references?
Everything is a direct reference, though it is possible for a single resource to have a list of direct references.
Okay, but it's a small number. We're talking tens.
Yeah,
at most.
Yeah, at most, yeah.
Did anyone suggest or ask about pod secret references, or was that might be like a third example? I don't know if someone had actually explored it or it was just punted by Tim or by someone in the conversation.
It has not come up in this context.
Okay. Because the node authorizer has a bunch of effective automatic rules. If I could see someone making an argument that I might want to create a secret reference policy that listed the, secret reference policy for something that a pod can mount across namespaces. And again, I'm not arguing for it necessarily, be it. I could see that set of arguments. A secret that you intended everyone on the entire cluster to use would have a very long list of people who could reference it. That's probably that's where we start getting into, okay, well, is there a difference in scopes and all of that down the road? Does Gateway we don't think Gateway has that problem?
It's possible. You could have a very long list of resources that wanted to target the same route. I think that's an uncommon use case, but there's nothing that restricts that from happening. One thing I will say that's related to secrets that I should mention as part of our scope here. One of the things we want reference policy to enable is to allow you to reference a certificate in a different namespace. So that would be stored in a secret. So if a gateway is in an infra namespace, and then you have a separate namespace that contains your certificates, you could enable that reference with reference policy.
Yeah, I mean, even 1,000 entries is not the end of the world for a list. It does get into the vein of, if you have a problem that's best solved by having a list of 1,000 namespaces, I think that's what Mo and I were chatting about earlier, is like in the long run, like super dense, complex clusters with lots of different entities of different security levels is lacking constructs that allow you to partition them. And that's some of that discussion. Smaller clusters or smaller chunks of namespaces is one way to approach that. So it doesn't seem like a blocker to me, even in the 1,000 case, to have a list with 1,000 items on it. And it's up to you to maintain that. You, the user who wants to allow all these people to reference it.
Makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, just based on everything you said, and I put this in chat, like this, the genericness of this, I can see, and Mike's point about principles also really interesting. But what you've spec'd here seems very reasonable and tractable, and you could be an awesome guinea pig to see if there's other patterns. A generic pattern isn't truly required to make this successful, and unless you can think of a reason, or you come up with a reason where no, the generic pattern would be expensive because of problem X, Y, or Z. It does seem pretty reasonable to go down the path you're on, and maybe use this as a learning experience where we could point others at Gateway to gain expertise before we do a generic type.
That makes a lot of sense. So just to clarify, it sounds like the design generally makes sense. It's not very clear that this makes sense as a generic type yet. My last question, I know this is already past time probably, but is for the current state where we have, Bucket API working and wanting to do cross namespace references, would the guidance for them be to just create their own similar concept to this for now, and eventually maybe we can merge these into a generic resource in the future?
I can't think of anything wrong with doing that. You might want to have a name that is specific, like a kind and a resource name that gives a little bit more context. Because, obviously 2 people with 2 reference policies with the same resource name, and you're always having to disambiguate by group. But we've dealt with that problem before, like Istio has a service. So I don't have a strong opinion one way or another. If there's nothing, like if you didn't think, oh, we want to call this a gateway reference policy, and reference policy felt superior, that might be the only subtle wrinkle there about having multiple of these all called reference policy. On the other hand, certainly if everybody had their own reference policy, then maybe it would force us in the client tools to be a little bit clearer about group ownership, and showing that if they had similar schemas, they might feel very compatible for users, and that would be an argument for a common schema.
So what version of Gateway are you planning on introducing this?
V1 Alpha 2.
Okay.
Which we're hoping to release by the end of the month. So it is coming pretty soon, unless we hear anything that blocks that.
I mean, it is an alpha, so I think, it's reasonable to experiment there. And yeah, I would like to see maybe how bucket reference policy thing and gateway reference policy develop maybe independently to solve kind of 2 specific use cases, and see if they have the same scoping semantics, would benefit from maybe more generic authorization model, and then that would be useful information to decide whether we want a unified reference policy or want to fold it into Kubernetes authorization.
So a related question to this, and I think we've kind of sort of converged on this. So this sort of policy mechanism seems sort of namespace based, similar to like the new PSP stuff. Is there any thoughts or desires on more expressive things like labels or user principles? Or are we sort of converging on the idea that we want to use the namespace as the intersection model?
Yes, we considered many variations here, including labels, and ultimately this API in V1 Alpha 1 was pretty heavy on labels, and we found it very confusing to work with. And this was one concept, at least again within the scope of Gateway API, where the number of cross namespace references felt like it would be much simpler to manage with these kind of direct references than a set of labels. But
that's actually a good bit of input. Like if cardinality of references or references is low, that might be a good way for us to say, like, hey, this pattern works when you have low cardinality. Do we have anybody who's got a high cardinality pattern, and does it not work? Like pod namespace policy on pod label selectors is an example of that. That triggered one more question for me in the references. Namespace UID and object UID. I'm not sure it's truly required, but because this is you're granting access to someone by name, obviously names can be reused. If the namespace is deleted and recreated, are you making the same argument there you have with the reason you didn't support resource name is because anybody who controls that destination namespace could obviously lie, or would a namespace UID and object UID be something that you could maybe anticipate having to add later?
Yeah, a UID has come up as a potential extension to this, but again, we're trying to start with the simplest use case. and not overcomplicate as much as possible. So we have left resource names out entirely. I think the first resource name we'd want to add is actually on the target side. That seems like something that is a very, I don't want to say glaring omission, but something that is a common request. The source UID, I don't know if it has the same level of value, but potentially.
Yeah, target, I was mostly thinking target there. And then you said-
target, you said delete namespace though, which would delete this reference policy. This is a namespace object, right?
Yeah.
So this would disappear if the namespace was deleted, right?
Right. So in the two, there is no name. It is just referring to the namespace that it is in. That's, yeah.
Yeah, this is the one that I was thinking of. Okay, so from and to. Okay, yeah, I get it. One of the nice advantages of materializing this object is that somebody who had a bunch of free time on their hands could go build a nice visualization of who's referencing what, and it makes consumption there easier. It's not an argument against the RBAC model, but it's certainly there is a relationship. You've explicitly described the relationship. You could attach data to the policy object, and you could do this for RBAC too with bindings if we had to. But you could imagine things like why this was getting granted, as well as ownership of that object being something that's pretty clear.
So on that note, one more question. I had it in the notes at some point here, but this does seem very similar to the RBAC types that already exist, and those exclude status. We've gone back and forth on whether we need spec and status or not on this. It's hard to completely understand what would put in status, but there's some edge cases where it could potentially be helpful. So on the RBAC side, have you ever regretted not having status, or is it just not relevant?
Status of what, right? There's more than one API server.
Or it's not a reconciled object. Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, and you could argue the same. In our case, we have multiple controllers that are going to be reading this any given reference policy. And so it's difficult, though not impossible, to populate any meaningful status as a result of that.
I'd say in secrets and config maps, this has been asked of as well. What was the other one? RBAC, what were some of the really, I'm drawing a blank on some of the really old objects. I wrote the section on recommendations. We had an argument about spec status. Does everything have to have status? It's kind of most things want spec and status if they feel like objects, and a reference policy doesn't feel like an object the same way that a gateway or an ingress or an HTTP route does. And so I'd probably say adding status to ingress, we had use cases for adding status to policy occasionally comes up. I think someone asked about this. Someone asked about a policy document. They wanted to know when it had been processed. But I think that gets into what Mo brought up as well, is there may be many different people consuming it. And so it's not always clear what data you would feed back. If there's no authoritative quote unquote, the policy then becomes a little bit problematic to have status.
One use case I've seen for item objects, sort of policy objects a bit like this in the past, is just having a status condition that tells you when the responsible controller has accepted it and has loaded it up.
And that's basically what I meant. There could be multiple responsible controllers. Is it when all controllers? Then you have to start thinking about lists of controllers. Pods. One of the nice things about pod status is the argument, and not just from the fact that it's a real object, but that was the first kube object where we made a lot of these concrete arguments, is that there's a single owner. The kubelet is a controller. There's an ownership relationship. Deployments is another example of there is an authoritative owner. If you couldn't immediately only ever be one owner of a particular object, or ownership hands off, so pods have scheduler name, technically you could imagine a different, scheduler being responsible. We talked about deployment controller having like custom controller field that says like, look, regular deployment controller, ignore me. But in all of those cases, it was a singleton ownership. And in this case, I guess it would be, could you ever imagine two controllers supporting this policy for different reasons or at the same time, in which case status gets a little confusing.
Yeah, and we have a very similar problem elsewhere in the API, but it's entirely possible for two different gateways implemented by two different implementations to target and serve the same application. And so that's valid. And so how we imagine status working here is that each controller could write what relationships this reference policy was enabling for them. Like what they, basically this reference policy has enabled this gateway to reference this secret or this service, whatever it is. But that list could get very long.
That feels like one which it's come up in a few other places. And I'd probably say, unless you have a really concrete reason now, starting without spec and status, and then, at worst, down the road, you have to add another word and you introduce a new resource type and you just read both. And this kind of that could happen on a 3-year time frame. But in the meantime, you would know for certain whether you need status pretty early. If you don't know that you need status, you probably don't need status.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So like if I was a user of this, oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
If I was a user of this and I was modifying, like I had a gateway implementation installed, had set up some reference policies, and now I modify one of the reference policies, and that causes the gateway controller to choke. And it continued, because it's using a watch, it continues using the old version of the reference policy. How do I, without a status condition, how do I even begin to know that that's happening? So if there's a status condition, I check it at the current, generation. I see that it's not accepted at the current generation or not ready at the current generation.
So this is mostly a question for the room. Has anyone seen experimentation around this specific kind of problem where instead of having a status on a resource, you have a status that reflects, like, for example, if your gateway controller is a series of pods, each pod creates an instance of some custom resource that contains a status where it effectively is writing out its understanding of the world, right? So it's not, hey, some random status that's shared by a bunch of controllers, like this pod right here has this status right now because it owns this one instance of this custom resource. And that's where it stores its state for the rest of the world to just observe, right? It's not, there's no spec, there's no driving it using that. It's just a way of it telling the world, hey, I have these 18 caches and this is the level they're all at. If you are wondering where I got to before I broke.
Well, I think it's more than having 18 caches in this case. So in a case where the policy needs to be continuously checked, it would be more like, this reference policy removed this reference's ability to exist. Please acknowledge in the status that you have unconfigured the load balancing, right?
Yeah, but you could represent that as a per pod. I'm using pod as air quotes here because it doesn't have to be a pod, but you could imagine a per instance of gateway controller. It could say, I have achieved the correct state for this resource version of this policy, meaning all the things that are supposed to have been done, as in, remove whatever load balancing networking stack for that revision. I have accomplished that. But just me, not the 18 other instances of me running on this cluster, just me, right? So then if a user wants to understand what has happened so far, they have to look at all of the instances and say, all right, do all of them make any sense?
So I would, if I had to put and this is more an art cut line, it really comes down to do you need that complexity? And does that complexity matter? So historically, we have said if it should happen fast and we can't come up with a use case that requires us to actually communicate this to users because it just doesn't come up often enough. We haven't done it. So RBAC policy propagation is a great example. In our EDE test, we run singleton HA Kube API servers in many distros or production environments, people running HA. In those configurations, the caches get out of date. Watch caches get out of date. Informer admission caches get out of date. And in general, it's in that like 0.0, it's somewhere less than 1% of a problem. And so it just falls into the, we could fix it. Would it be worth the time, effort, right budget, complexity? And generally has been no. So I think it's if you believe that users will continuously have slow controllers gateways reading these policies, I think it would come up more. If you can credibly believe that you can get the end-to-end propagation latency down under 20 or 50 or 100 milliseconds, barring latency, then it may just not be an issue. That's basically been the heuristic, I think, that has in practice gotten implemented in Kube. And if anybody disagrees, feel free to correct me. This is what thinking about like admission in the core, like the namespace admission is driven by a cache. That cache can actually get out of date, and you can't create namespaces because the cache is out of date. We did a few mitigations and said, it's good enough, stick the duct tape on and move along.
Yeah, that seems like a reasonable pattern here. And it seems like we probably don't need status.
Awesome. One last question, just for completeness, and then we should probably move on to next topics. Is this SIG storage use case the same as the bucket API? Or are there independent SIG storage?
Because it's got my name.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome. Cool. All right. Thank you for the discussion. I hope that was helpful. Thought that was pretty interesting. All right. Let's move on to designs of note. Is this a design, Mo?
No, this was meant as
PR of note.
Yeah, it's meant as a question for what we should do to move this forward. So, Sergey, you're on the call, so you can provide more context. But the TLDR is we made a bad metric that can break people's clusters. And what should we do to not break people's stuff? Should we delete the metric? Is there a different, better metric that still gives us what we expected out of this metric?
Can you explain the current situation and problem?
Yeah, I can chime in. Hey, this is a search from the auth team in OpenShift. And yes, the thing is, this is a metric that was introduced to track the amount of root CA search published in the root CA cert publisher. And it's a cool debug metric to have. However, we have a little problem with that. And if you scroll down to the metrics test, you can see it right away, exactly where the namespace labels are there, because these are problematic. Up a little bit, up. Where is it? I literally saw it in the scroll. It's gone. The thing is, this metric tracks the amount of root CAs published per namespace. Here we go. This is
yeah,
exactly. So what you can see here is that we got in line 123, we got the root CA cert published in namespace test NS with the HTTP status code 200 2 times, right? So this is sort of like what the metric says, and obviously that's good for debugging because we have the information per namespace, and well, sometimes the root CA cert publishing can fail for a given namespace. Like in this test, you have the case for a 404 or even a 500. So that's a very nice debugging metric to have. However, it causes, as unfortunately is often the case, and Clayton, who's on the call, probably knows that because we ever often debug why Prometheus tends to in our setups. Namespace essentially is an unbounded label value. Compared to, for instance, the HTTP status code, which is just a known set of values, the namespace count can vary drastically. And what happens essentially is that we have like an indefinite number of metrics. The question to this group is twofold. A, for this specific metric, does it make sense to track it per namespace? Yes or no? If not, if it's good enough to have it per code globally, then we could simply remove the namespace and the label is gone. And for the record, in OpenShift, we specifically disabled this very metric during the last rebase because it simply crashed Prometheus.
Serge,
yeah,
I was going to ask, do we allow? I thought SIG instrumentation had a no unbounded cardinality on user input in the core metrics principle.
Yes.
Is that a hard or soft principle?
It's a soft principle. So we have a cap out there for metric cardinality enforcement. And you can specify as a command line parameter allow metric labels, and it's an opt-in setting. So what you have to do is, you recognize there's something wrong with your metrics, and then you can instrument API server to limit the set of labels and label values to a known set. But you have to do this sort of like after you figure out a problem. And that's sort of like the problematic thing. What we do concretely in OpenShift, we simply don't scrape that metric at all. We disregard it, but it's an opt-in way, right? And I think that's a little bit problematic. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, we've had some of these regressions over the last like 5-6 years where we strip cardinality out. We got the cap. I vaguely remember the cap to go into it. Is in this particular case, like it would certainly be like anything that has this high cardinality would have to be mega important for a large class of people using Kubernetes. And historically, we've said like only like a very few things have this cardinality, like the number of requests coming into resources, and like that's bounded in other dimensions. Like people with lots of CRDs are already starting to break some of those. But this one seems very unusual in KubeCore today of one label per namespace. Are there any others that exist right now?
I don't know off the top of my head, but I do know we disabled a couple of other cases where we're tracking the namespace label. It's a common theme where especially the namespace label turned out to be problematic. But I would have to enumerate. There are a couple of cases, I'm sure. Yes.
Yeah, and then the bar would just be: is this a super critical metric, or is it completely worthless if the cardinality is reduced? Would be like the two common questions that usually get asked in these scenarios.
I've been asking the question to the original poster. He said it would be nice for debugging. And I think, what we could do is, I think per code is essentially good enough right now, I believe, unless Mo, maybe you have a little bit more insights on the root CA cert publisher semantics if having the namespace label. So is there a case where the root CA cert publisher can fail on a namespace with the 500, but succeed on another namespace with the 200 for some reason? Maybe Mo, you have some more historical knowledge about this specific publisher.
I think that would be unusual.
Sorry, Mike.
I was just going to say, I think that would be unusual. And yeah, so I guess looking at the change here, it seems kind of weird to me to reduce a counter. I thought my expectations of those are usually monotonically increasing. So I don't know what downstream effects that would have deleting values from them. And honestly, I cannot think of a case where namespace is actually that useful for monitoring. Debugging, there are other tools such as looking at logs to figure out what's going on. Yeah. So
exactly. I mean, this specific pull request is from Standa. Standa, I don't know. Are you on the call?
I am.
Yeah, exactly. So Standa contributed that fix, and this is a clever fix. The question for this group is: A, do we need the namespace desperately? If we do need the namespace for this metric, and I'm hearing between the lines we don't necessarily need it, but if we would need it, then this is a clever solution by Standa, who essentially, whenever a namespace is being deleted, the corresponding metrics are removed from memory, which would cause them not to be rendered on the /metrics endpoint from API server, right? So this is a nice workaround. And then also this cardinality issue would be somehow reduced because Prometheus would then not scrape, all the metrics.
I just noticed this is a histogram too.
Yes. Yes.
Oh dear
yes.
Lord, no. We've already
deleted
histograms across high cardinality. Yeah. So
yeah.
I think like I would at least my gut on this, just looking and knowing some of the context behind a little bit of the metric, but not all of it, is like someone needs to make the case that namespace is important, and it has to be a very good reason, like very good. That would fit with our general stance on review of metrics in Cube, enforced across most of the SIGs that because I helped with some of this stuff historically, so I'm not completely making this up as I go, but it would have to be a really good reason, and the SIG would need to justify why it's a really good reason to have namespace label.
Very cool. Okay, so here's my suggestion. We will set up or we will submit a PR removing, and the good news is this metric is on alpha API level. So we can sort of like break the metrics API, like the API or the contract for this API should be fine. We will submit a pull request completely removing the namespace label. And Stana, we have been shortly talking about this as well, right? That would make the whole logic easier.
Yeah. I think drop in the namespace, based on everything that has been said here, it makes the most sense. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you for raising this.
Cool.
Cool. So Mo, thoughts on formalizing etcd API used by Cube as KMS replacement? Please expand.
Yeah, I was like, I don't know if 5 minutes is enough, but if it's not, we can just continue the conversation next time. But the TLDR is, I've been thinking about the various improvements that Nish and Rita are proposing for KMS to fix the issues we have with it in the current beta state. And sort of stepping back from it, the question I would ask is, should we try to expand the surface area of that API a bunch to sort of help it express what's missing and try to address all the issues, performance and scalability, as well as the various other bits that we've talked about over the years? Or would it be simpler or easier to work with SIG API machinery to more to formalize the bits of the etcd API that we rely on, which is transactions, range request, compaction, leases, probably something else that I've forgotten, and sort of write that down and enforce it at the code level somehow, that you cannot start using new bits and pieces of the etcd API without writing a KEP or something. Once that is formalized as this is the API contract, so it's not that we rely literally on etcd, it's that we rely on this subset of the etcd gRPC API. Then it becomes easier for someone to build a shim layer that does anything they want in between. So as for example, Rancher's Kind project sort of does that today for SQL-based backends. But they do that by just making assumptions about the API calls the Cube API server will make, right, for the gRPC API. It's not, they're not relying on a stable interface. They're just relying on the observation of these are the APIs we happen to call. But once you have such a shim, right, I could imagine us building the current KMS implementation out of tree, or just moving it out of tree using the shim. So we could continue to support that as a backwards compatibility thing. You have it, you can use it if you want it. But then it would allow us to have an encryption layer that has basically different opinions, right? Like today we have the envelope encryption that says, that we're going to generate data encryption keys and hands you that over the KMS gRPC API, and you're gonna use the KMS key encryption key to encrypt that and then send it back to us. And like there's a prefixing series, and like there's a bunch of assumptions about like we give you one data encryption key per write and all that stuff that, and you know, we will serialize, we will serially decode things one key at a time. I feel like all of those things might be better handled by a storage layer implementation that actually, like for example, if etcd did encryption inside of itself for all values, I feel like that would be valuable. But you can imagine if etcd doesn't want to get into that business, that if you could implement a small shim layer to do that for you, you may make different choices that are not bound by whatever we think in SIG Auth is the correct way to do envelope encryption, as for example. So that's the high level TLDR. It's just, does anyone think such an approach would make more sense than trying to fix KMS?
So the problem that it's solving is moving the what we do in Cube down a layer, or is that a correct summary of the problem that this would solve? Like
the main problem it's trying to solve is we have stated a set of opinions about how encryption, envelope encryption should work, which is that your KMS is handed data encryption keys, and then we will use them to encrypt data in a particular way, store it on disk, and then we will ask for those data encryption keys to be decrypted and handed back to us, and then we will give you back the data. Basically, we have made a very strong set of opinions about how encryption at rest with KMS works. And an alternate solution that I'm sort of proposing to the KMS problem is, can we just let you do whatever you want for your encryption? That way, instead of us asserting every single opinion about it, maybe, you know, your KMS has different needs or requirements. That's.
And I mean, I was kind of reading in between the lines there, Mo. You were like, well, what if you could just point to a different storage, or you could just make the underlying layer do encryption at rest for you, and so we get out of the business of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, has anyone ever seriously considered doing etcd encryption at rest in etcd? I mean, that was one of the in the original discussion when we added secret encryption. I'm pretty sure one of them was like, it'd be really nice if this wasn't our problem. And at the time, there wasn't really most of the effort on etcd was focused on stability and scale and perf stuff. Has that changed?
So I will admit I am very disconnected from etcd development. I actually have absolutely no idea who works on it and what they're.
Yeah, this might be a good API machinery question. I haven't seen any designs come across recently, but I haven't been looking for those specifically. But I mean, it's a great question, right? Like the core question you're asking is, should we be doing really complicated encryption at rest above a storage layer when it's at rest encryption only, and we're loading it all in memory and holding it all in memory and like 500 caches across the entire distributed system? Probably.
Yep. Like I intended a talk, and I know we're out of time, where Intel was talking about how they built a KMS that used their secure enclave to do this encryption. And I was like, you realize that literally all of the data is sitting in memory of the API server process, right? Like, who cares that you use the KMS to like hold on to the keys? Literally, the unencrypted data is sitting in memory of the API server process. Like, I don't understand.
Well, and in every ingress controller process, and in every
right.
every controller manager process, and in every kubelet.
Yeah, and I also get bugged out by the fact that we tell you to encrypt specific resources. I just want to encrypt the whole thing. Like, I don't want to think about what I have or have not encrypted, because people like to put secrets in config maps. I don't know why.
So,
but...
yeah, I think in general, when I look at KMS, I do think that it has enough adoption in beta that we have to be delicate with how we evolve it towards GA. So yeah,
and I agree. And my thought there is that if we ever removed it, we would make it so that you could somehow continue to use exactly the same KMS plugin in some sane way without you having to basically get like something that doesn't require you to have a series of software engineers to solve the problem, like a reasonable YAML configuration style thing.
Yeah, I think that would be the success criteria there, especially like around performance, where we know that performance, not necessarily this type of performance where we're copying through a shim, but performance issues have been something that is plaguing the beta. So we just have to be careful. Awesome. Let's hoist this up for next meeting, Mo. We can talk
we can.
about it in more detail.
Should I, as an action item, bring this up in next week's API machinery meeting? Ask them what they think.
Yeah, I think that would be useful.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. I can do that. Thanks, y'all.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. A little overtime. I guess we will see you all in 2 weeks.